Morning, Eileen. Father Charlie's January the 13th, 1991, testing.
Today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, in the first chapter, the 9th verse. And it happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately when he came up out of the water, he saw the heavens open, and the Spirit come down upon him as a dove, and remaining upon him. And a voice was heard from the heavens saying, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." And immediately the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. Baptism by water and by fire. Jesus presents himself in some fashion that transcends normal human experience. I think the church has gone a little too far with that by making him God, because Jesus really never claimed to be God with a capital G. But Jesus did claim to be God with a little g. However, he wasn't selfish about that, and proclaimed that all of us are God with a little g. Now, this maze of contradictions about the divinity of Christ constantly afflicts the Orthodox. What is this divinity of which Jesus partakes? Is it that divinity only of which we partake? Is it a higher degree of that divinity in which we partake? Is it a fuller realization of that divinity in which we partake? Or is it something that so transcends human experience as to be unattainable by anyone else? It is proven through the centuries that if it is the latter, it's almost worthless. Because after all, what good is an example you can't imitate? The purpose of Jesus coming to the earth in this fashion is to provide an example that can be imitated. And the beginning of that imitation is being born. After all, that's pretty basic. If you are born a human being, why then you are like every other human being in that respect. And there is a certain extraordinary equality involved in that. The macho generations have always claimed, of course, you're not quite human unless you're born a male. In the Catholic Church, we still cling to that. You can't be pope unless you're a male. It says qualifications for being pope are mas baptizatus, a baptized male. Baptism is curable. Maleness is difficult to cure. Not impossible. However, of course, we begin to understand that the gift is bigger than that, and that the gift of femaleness is something perhaps even more to be treasured than maleness. And the mas baptizatus really will probably resolve itself to the fact that to be pope, you have to be a human being. Well, that we could deal with a little better. There is a rumor that one woman made it anyway. She pretended to be a man and was elected pope, the Popist Joan. There is a legend of her. And I suspect she probably did. In the Middle Ages, you could do anything, you know. But in any event, it's the baptism. This baptism of Jesus is another curious kind of contradiction. Why in the world was Jesus baptized? And you notice in the beginning, excuse me, I have some kind of an obstruction this morning. There. In the beginning, John objects to the baptism, and he says, "What? You come to me to be baptized? I should rather be baptized by you." Jesus says, no, enough of that stuff. Go ahead, do it now. It becomes all justice. But there's another reason for that. Jesus is saying, you see, I am like you, and what I expect you to do, I will do myself. I am providing you an imitable example. Now there's something else that Jesus does. Jesus has an ambition that begins to make him sound like, like God. But God with an intermediate G. God with a little g seems to belong to humanness. God with a large G seems to belong only to the ultimate divinity. But God with a middle-sized G belongs to something which the Buddha describes, and which is truly mysterious to the Western mind, but which we should pay attention to. I've been over this many, many times, little by little, though it begins to sink in what it might mean. This curious, mysterious, even mystical quality of being a human being, which allows you to expand in the aura of the earth, with your own aura. The idea of Hindu Buddhism is beginning to permeate Christianity at long last in a very profound degree, upsetting the orthodox. But what it proclaims is that holiness is expanding your aura. And that this is something that you can do by practice. And expanding your aura and expanding consciousness are curiously alike. And what it refers to is having your aura extend further out from you so that you perceive more and more of the world as being within the ambit of your being. Now, the Hindu traditions speak of threes, of course. Hindu tradition is very Trinitarian. It speaks of the Holy Three. And the Holy Three is basically a tuning fork. That a human being is like a tuning fork. Two sides of your body are the two tune forks, one on each side, and the tone is the third that vibrates between them. And that this tuning fork sends its tone outward. And as the quality of the tuning fork is improved, the tone goes further out. It may be more than an analogy, by the way. It may be an identity when we consider the DNA. But anyway, this expansion of the aura outward starts with 3 feet. It's a conical aura. 3 feet at the solar plexus, and 30, 300, 3,000, 3 miles, 3,000 miles, and finally the whole earth. The aura of the Buddha, it is said, fills the whole earth. Making analogies, that seems to be Christ's ambition, is to have his aura fill the whole earth. Think about that for a minute. Because if Christ's ambition is to have his aura fill the whole earth, it's an imitable example. According to this premise, he asks us all to have our aura fill the whole earth. That we become one with all humanity. Think about that for a moment. What an absolutely outrageous ambition. And yet somehow down deep inside something rings when you hear this. Is that an outrageous ambition? No. It's an ambition full of crucifixion and suffering. Because if your aura fills the whole earth, then you're sensitive not only to all the glory and wonder there may be, but all the suffering, and all the problems as well. The story of the Christ and the expansion of Ora to fill the whole earth is the basic tenet of what I call post-secular theology. Now, there's a phrase for you. Post-secular theology. All the theology we have today, or most of it, or 9/10 of it, or 99% of it, is pre-secular theology. And pre-secular theology demands that you go back to the good old days. And you think of God as your fathers did, and your mothers did, and your ancestors did. But it turns out that we have a serious problem with that. And the problem with that is we know more about the world than our ancestors did. We know more about how it works. We know more about space and time. And the concepts of our ancestors simply don't fit with this kind of knowledge. They're not sufficient. There's a seed in them that is sufficient, but the sufficiency is not there. And the challenge to the God of our fathers that is placed for us is the challenge of the secular world. Saeculum, the cycle, the world, in its knowledge, has thrown up a huge barrier against the simple faith of our fathers. According to the simple faith of our fathers, the world was flat, man was in the earth, God was in heaven, you did your thing here and then you went there, and that was it. Well, apparently that's not it. There's something a great deal more involved. Is there a God after a secular view of the universe? That's the problem we all face. Not only in California, but in Iraq. What kind of a God is it that our expanding aura will meet in a post-secular world? Because you see, my belief is a dangerous and daring one. I believe that post-secular theology is not less splendid than pre-secular theology, but far more splendid. And I believe that the capacity for union with God involved in it is far greater. All of us are impacted by this problem, even though we have never articulated it. We struggle with it every day. It's the agony of our Muslim brothers in particular. We have it, but right now they have it acutely, and they're about to die of it. And as our aura expands into the world, we're going to die of it too. We reach out to the Middle East through our acquaintance with some young men, and perhaps older ones, who are about to die. Remember what it says in the arena of ancient Rome? Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. Moriturus, about to die. And each of us is about to suffer those deaths, along with those who die. But I would point out to you that the Iraqis on the other side, who are going to have that arsenal dumped on them, are going to die in vastly greater numbers, and that they are just as much our brothers and sisters as the Americans we know. And if the aura of our world expands so that it fills the whole earth as Christ and Buddha, we will suffer from that very directly and very assuredly. To paraphrase the thing, it must be that wars come. But blessed are those who regret it. The aura of the Christ fills the whole earth. Jesus is a paragon of example. Jesus' functioning in the post-secular world will not be less than in the pre-secular world, but vastly greater. In the post-secular world, Jesus is a compatriot of Buddha, not a rival. On this eve of destruction, we are caused to meditate. How will we react? Baptism by fire? Perhaps. We are all aware that there is something involved in this baptism in the Middle East, something curiously focused, something vastly more significant than anything that has happened in our lifetime up to this time. We have all been involved in wars, most of us, one way or the other. Several of us, several wars. The Second World War. Memory of the first is pretty strong for some of us. Second World War. Korea. Vietnam. Spread of terrorism. Cold War. And now Iraq. A lot of wars. A lot. And it seems they never end. But this one has a quality to it. The wars with Germany were old-style wars. And we could get all excited and go marching off to war and die bitterly in battle and come back with a sense of national vindication, etc., having saved the world for democracy, etc. But then began the Cold War wars. And the Cold War wars were not against Germany, but against the Soviet Union. And those had another quality to them. They were not simple. In all those wars, we felt ourselves sometimes, somehow, being opposed to ourselves in the very war that was being fought. And it was an uncomfortable feeling. In Vietnam in particular, nobody was at all sure who was right. And maybe least of all us. We were very confused by that. Because in the Cold War, the capitalist part of ourself was fighting with the communist part of ourselves. And lo and behold, we discovered that they are us. Because communism is only a cover for social concern. Perhaps distorted social concern, but social concern nonetheless. And capitalism is nothing more than the struggle for an adequate lifestyle. And an adequate lifestyle and social concern are not irreconcilable with one another, I hope. You know? And now the Berlin Wall is down, and we begin to discover that perhaps we can have a compromise and live in a world in which this question need not be settled by war, because, of course, it could never be settled by war, could it? In the final analysis, we are locked into social concern as much as we are to individual survival and lifestyle. But now a war looms on the horizon which isn't about that, although it seems to be, but it's not. This war is a war about post-secular theology. This war is a war about God. And that's very confusing. We are now confronting a nation who takes God seriously in the old way. And we feel very self-conscious because we don't take God seriously in almost any way. If we could say it's a war between those who take God seriously in a new way against those who take God seriously the old way, that might be easy, but we don't do that because we haven't taken God seriously in a new way yet. We've simply not taken God seriously at all for quite some time. Now, that's secularism, by the way. Secularism means not taking God seriously. Taking only this world seriously and nothing beyond it. And of course, we're not very comfortable with that either. We would rather have a different face to put on. But what we're called upon to do now, it seems to me, is to begin to imitate the example of Jesus and realize that this may be a baptism of fire for us. It may be a baptism that will test us to see whether we do take God seriously or whether we'd like to, whether it's important enough. I remember one professor in the seminary saying to us, you know, all of us today speak of how outrageous it is for people in the Middle Ages to have gone to war about religion. Protestants fought the Catholics, Christians fought the Muslims. He said, today, rather, we think it's all right to go to war for economics. He said, which is really worth dying for the most? Your faith or your pocketbook? Perhaps neither. But it does put it in a curious perspective, doesn't it? Now all of a sudden we're back to the other style of war. We are into a war that is going to have long and protracted fallout in terms of the struggle for God. Muslims are increasingly moved to fundamentalism in a certain area. But don't let that fool you. Underneath it all, the Muslims are being moved massively to secularism. And that struggle within the world of Islam is absolutely cataclysmic. Remember the story in Iran? Why did the Shah get thrown out of the country? In the final analysis, because he secularized it too fast. It was that simple. And what happened when they kicked him out? It went into knee-jerk fundamentalism immediately, didn't it? Or it seemed to. Actually, of course, it didn't. You know, if you watch Iran, you begin to have some funny feelings. One Iranian, whom I talked to in Berlin, curious place to might meet him, told me something. He said, what is going on in Iran anyway? That's the next problem. And he said, oh, well, you know, 90% of us Iranians are terribly tired of all this Ayatollah business. We want to get on with living in the modern world. He said, only 10% of us are fundamentalists. Unfortunately, they have all the guns right now. Think about that. You know, it's very curious that now we're going to war with Iraq, which is probably the most secular of the Muslim countries. Hussein says he wants to fight a holy war, but the Saudis had the perfect answer. Holy war, in order to fight a holy war, one thing is necessary. You have to be holy. And clearly, Saddam Hussein is not holy by any standards, not even his own, and surely not by Muslim standards. Saddam Hussein is a very suspect man because he's a secularizer, not exactly like the Shah, but something like the Shah. And so consequently, we have this broil of feelings and problems and troubles. I saw a picture in the paper this morning that showed 4 panels. One was Americans in the Saudi desert riding around in a tank. Another was Iraqi school children hiding under desks. Another was, I think it was Palestinians starving. And the third was the Emir of Kuwait lying asleep in a luxurious bed. Curious mixed signals, aren't they? But Saddam Hussein is a secularizer. And if we destroy him, which we no doubt will probably within a week, the field will be cleared for a great resurgence of fundamentalism in Iraq and throughout the Middle Eastern world. Curiously, the Iranians, who have been most leaders in that, are liable to flip over onto the other side in the process. But the struggle goes on. And this will be a baptism by fire for the Muslims as they struggle and strive and suffer into the secular world. And here we are, living in the secular world and trying to get beyond it. I must tell you a story of just how tragic this situation is. You recall that the Roman Catholic Church had an ecumenical council in 1963 called Second Vatican Council. It was so long ago now everybody's forgotten. 27 years after all. 28. Well, anyway. And the Second Vatican Council was a triumph of the secular world. In it, basically, the forces involved said bah humbug to the God of the Middle Ages. And the Pope has been fighting against it ever since. The present Pope doesn't like the Second Vatican Council. Neither have any of the popes since that time liked it very much, even though they tried to give it lip service. Its consequences are absolutely too horrendous for any pope to deal with, because the Vatican insists upon the God of the Middle Ages, who, of course, is dead. And this is a tragedy of huge proportions. But at the same time that all of this agony was going on in the Christian world, the Muslims were holding an ecumenical council in Cairo, which didn't even make it into the news. But it was just like the Catholic one. There were imams from the whole Muslim world, from Indonesia to Morocco. And in that ecumenical council, one item on the agenda tells the whole story. Is the world round or flat? It was on the agenda. Think about that for a minute. At least the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church, wouldn't have that item on the agenda. It had several others that were similar, by the way, but nonetheless, pardon me, they didn't have that one. But the bad news is not that the item was on the agenda. The bad news is that the imams voted that it was flat. In 1963, the majority of the spiritual leaders of the Muslim world voted the world was flat. Do you see the agony involved in that? The pain? The terror? The coming tragedy involved in that vote? Because if the imams believed that, who are fairly well educated, surely the masses of Muslims were far behind. In the last 25 years, that's changed, but not definitively. The majority of Muslims would still vote. that the world is flat. Impossible! No, not impossible. The Muslims, in spite of all the pushing and shoving, are still not in the secular world. By the way, do you know what the most dangerous agent for the secular world is? It's a washing machine. And a dryer. In order to have a washing machine and a dryer, you have to have a complete change of attitude toward heaven. And every time it's turned on to wash the clothes, it will drive you a little further in that direction. Because in order to have a washer and a dryer, which every woman wants, you have to be able to fix it. And you have to be able to understand something like electricity. You have to put in all kinds of grids and turn society over to things like power companies and understand generators and modern technology of all sorts. It's only one example, but it's the most dramatic, I think. One Iranian said that. Well, after all, if we are to be in the modern world, we have to have washers and dryers. That's why we want to be in the modern world. Oh, are we going to avoid that? We're not. And the attitude that comes and the change involved is right behind. Quote, by parallel, an old Arab parable. You've all heard it. When the camel gets his nose under the tent. The whole camel cannot be far behind.